Hi, Misha here, and in this video, as promised, we're going to talk about the Israeli IAI Kfir. And actually, this is a variant known as the F-21 Lion in U.S. aggressor scheme. Very interesting stories. This is going to be kind of more of a story video based on the Mirage. Well, as I said in the Mirage video, Israel was one of the biggest users. In fact, Israel had been a really good customer for Dassault. They started receiving the Mirage 3 and basically a specific version for Israel known as the 3CJ. These started to be delivered in 1962 and was Israel's first Mach 2 Plus fighter, one of their most advanced fighters, and they used it to great success. They had proven it was a very good combat plane prior, but really it earned its stripes in 1967 during the 6 Days War, where it downed nearly 50 aircraft with no direct losses. However, the Israelis weren't 100% happy with the Mirage 3. It was designed in France for use in Europe. They wanted a version that was less of an interceptor and more of a multi-role with ground support capability, basically a light bomber attacker. To this end, around 1964-1965, Dassault began working on what would become the Mirage 5. Essentially, they would remove the all-weather capability, making it a daytime or fair-weather plane, because let's be honest, in Israel there's not a lot of storm clouds or fog or other things, so they removed some avionics and radar equipment, made room for additional fuel tanks, because another issue was range. The Mirage 3 was known for having a somewhat limited range. Israel needed more. They also increased its weapons loadout and capability. And yeah, the Mirage 5. Israel was impressed. They placed an order. Originally, they ordered 30 with an option for 20 more, which Dassault had more or less completed in 1968 and was about ready to deliver. Issue was, also in 1968, the Israeli Air Force conducted a raid on Lebanon, something that the French government was not pleased about. Therefore, in January of 1969, France put a weapons embargo on Israel, meaning Dassault could not deliver the Mirage 5, even though Israel had paid for the order. What happens next is a little bit unknown and hazy. Here are the facts. By September of 1969, Israel was test flying what they would ultimately call the Nesher, which means Griffin, which appeared to be an exact or near exact copy of the Mirage 5, which they would then put into production. It would actually be, flown as a full plane in early 1971, named Nesher and adopted in late 1971. It was in Israeli Air Force service by 1972. It was there in time for the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So, the Nesher existed. They made 51 single-seat fighters, and they made 10 trainers. But how did Israel make an exact copy of a Mirage and make it very quickly? Well, there's many stories. It is true that Israel had already been kind of preparing to make Mirages domestically already. So they were kind of getting the infrastructure set up. It is said that the blueprints, the drawings, the tech packages for the Mirage 5 had already been delivered to Israel before the embargo. Another story has it that the Mirage 5 was smuggled into Israel in pieces and crates. Another story has it that an American company was used as kind of a third party to get the plans and specs and stuff. It's also said that Israeli spies, the Mossad, obtained prints, tech, some examples. Even Switzerland is implicated because they were producing the Mirage 3 under license, and it's said that they perhaps helped Israel, especially with the engine. At the end of the day, the story is unclear. Heck, it's even been said that the owner of Dassault himself directly aided and assisted. But because there was an official embargo, you can understand why it's kind of murky. Well, the Nesher was a copy of the Mirage 5, but IAI thought they could do a little better and began working on its replacement. It was kind of a stopgap, an interim measure. In 1969 also, the USA started sending F-4 Phantoms to Israel, along with their J-79 engine. So basically what they did, they took the Mirage 5 airframe and they stuck a J-79 in it. It was considered a good choice because it was already being used by the Phantoms, and actually, ultimately, the USA gave a license for production, legally, for them to make it. And this would ultimately become the Kfir. Now, the first prototype was essentially a Mirage 3 retrofitted with the J-79. This first flew in September of 1970. Then next they would take a Nesher and retrofit it with the J-79. And then finally they would get to a full all-new prototype by 1973 and fly it. This would ultimately be adopted in late 1975 by the Israeli Air Force as the Kfir, which means lion cub, C-1. And it was very similar to the Mirage 5, but it was a little different, obviously, because of the engine. The American engine was a little wider and a little shorter than the French. It also ran hotter, so they had to kind of change up the body a bit to fit it in there. They put a heat shield around it, and they also added additional cooling intakes. It had Israeli-made avionics. It also had an updated cockpit, a little more roomy, for one thing. It had more ground attack capability. It could carry rockets, bombs, or missiles. Proportionally, dimensionally, it had the same 27-foot wing as the Mirage 3, but it was a little bit longer at about 51 feet. It's a little bit slower at about Mach 2, but it had a higher max altitude of over 58,000 feet, and it had more range, more endurance because of additional fuel tankage. It had two 30mm cannon, like the Mirage, but whereas the Mirage had 125 rounds per gun, the Kfir had a few more at 140 rounds, again assisting its ground attack role. This was too late for the Yom Kippur War, but it was used against Lebanon in the late 70s and into the early 80s. It only has one confirmed air-to-air kill, a Syrian MiG-21, back in 1979. Its days as an air superiority primary fighter for Israel were very brief because as early as 1976, the USA started sending over the brand new F-15 to Israel, and then later the F-16 came in, meaning the Kfir ended up being pretty darn redundant. So, because it did have ground strike capability, they kind of retrofitted it to that, and by the 1980s, that's what it was mostly used for, was unescorted ground attack missions. Its production was quite brief, but more were made than the Nesher, about 220 of these total. The original C1 was replaced by the upgraded C2, which this is actually quite similar to here. And eventually there was the C7, which was a dedicated ground attack variant or version. The the Israeli Air Force, the IAF, would keep the Kfir around in one way or another through the 90s, and then they would basically either sell some off or mothball them. Funnily enough, in the 21st century, IAI has refurbished many Kfirs and is offering them on the secondary market, even with a full warranty. Now, as far as the U.S. planes, back in 1985, the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marines, obtained 25 of these to use in asymmetric warfare training. These were meant as enemy aggressor aircraft during the war games. The Navy would take 12 and the Marines would take 13. And this would be mocked up to simulate the MiG-23, which was the big threat in the 1980s as far as fighters. And this plane kind of had similar characteristics, fast, but not necessarily heavily armed or all that maneuverable. Anyway, and these were used for a few seasons for that. It was adopted into U.S. service as the F-21, and some sources say F-21A Lion. But its time was quite short-lived. The Navy would send theirs back to Israel in 1988, and the Marines in 1989, and replace them with the F-5E Tiger. Kind of a feline theme there. So that's kind of the story behind the Israeli Kfir and the Nesher and Mirage 5. And there's a lot more to it, of course, but I thought I'd give a brief overview. Please, if you're interested, check it out, because it's definitely a good read. This model, like the one over there that was featured in the first Mirage video, is a 1/72 scale diecast from Falcon. They're about the only ones to do a Kfir or an F-21. It's a good model for what it is. I mean, it does have 2 air-to-air missiles, Sidewinder types, under the wings. It's mostly all metal. This one does have enough of cockpit space that I was able to get a bit of a pilot in there. It's a little roomier. And it has the small canards on the side and the aerial refueling probe. So it's not bad for what it is. And again, when these were new, they were not all that expensive. So no Corgi or Hobbymaster, but certainly I'd say a step up from Oxford or certainly a Mercom. And Falcon had a habit of just making planes that no one else did. Probably because I don't know if they cared much about having actual licenses to make their planes. Israel. Wouldn't that be funny if, IAI made this without license from Dassault, Yet they got on to a model maker's case for making a small little metal plastic model of their plane without permission. Seems one of those things that could happen in the business world, huh? Alrighty, folks. Hope you enjoyed that, and if for some reason you haven't checked out the Mirage video, you might want to do it. Any questions or comments? Please post them below. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.